Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
Speaking truth to power ought to be the duty of journalism, but it is not. Speaking the power's truth is the way to get and keep the gig in today's media, and if you do, you will be richly rewarded with money and flattery.
One of our frequent guests, Patrick Cockburn, had a great journalist father, Claud Cockburn, who said that the relationship of the journalist to the power should be that of the dog to the lamppost. Nothing is true, he'd say, until it has been officially denied.
In the inverted world we live in, it is now the job of mainstream journalism to treat those like our first guest as the proverbial lamppost, and then to extinguish its light. Fortunately, every now and then emerges a journalist who goes where few dare, who speaks what few will speak without fear or favour. One such journalist is Eva Bartlett, and she joins us now. A particular welcome to you, Eva. You have been at the front line, not just in Syria, about which we want to talk mainly, but also in North Korea, in Gaza, and elsewhere. What has drawn you into such trepidatious waters, and from where have you found the courage to speak that truth to power?
Thank you, George, and thank you, Gayatri. I'm always quite honest about the fact that until my late 20s, I was completely ignorant of political events in the world. And so when I actually discovered the genocide, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, it had a massive impact on me. And after doing quite a bit of research, I eventually decided to go to occupied Palestine to see for myself. And spending 8 months in the West Bank with the ISM in some of the most dangerous for Palestinians areas, Nablus.
Well, also for volunteers, of course, Rachel Corrie and Tom Herndl and others.
Yes, yes. But, I mean, certainly Palestinians are every day being killed or maimed or imprisoned, and we never hear about that.
The Gaza situation, Israel-Palestine, is complicated but more clear-cut than the Syrian question. What were the reasons why you ended in Syria? What did you find there that was so contrasting to how the Western media were covering it elsewhere?
Well, excuse me, until March 2013, I was still living in Gaza, but I was paying very keen attention to what was happening in Syria. From the very beginning, I got a sense that something was wrong with what the media was telling us was happening in Syria. And after a lot of research, I knew the media was wrong, but it's always good to actually go to the place in question and talk with the people in question. And so in April 2014, I went to Syria, and everywhere I went, people told me, look, we wanted political change, but from the beginning, it was not about political change. And people in Syria are very well informed. They were telling me, this is a proxy war on our country. This is not about anything to do with our president, our government, our leadership. This is about outside forces coming in and taking our land, and we refused that. And that was, in the beginning, but I've traveled extensively throughout Syria. In some of the places that the media has said is under a revolution, Old Homs, for example, Aleppo, and other areas that we'll get into. And everywhere I've been, people have said, no, this was never a revolution. We want Syria to return to how it was prior to 2011. It was a safe country.
It's almost like a parallel universe. The villains are painted as heroes. The heroes are painted as villains. Those who are in fact villains but made into heroes receive accolades, Oscars, lavish funding. And this story is nowhere more sharply illustrated than the story of the white helmets. Tell us about that.
They're one of the most absurd examples of war propaganda, but they're dressed up in white uniforms, white helmets, and they're dressed up in a narrative that is completely false. The narrative goes that they're neutral, they're unarmed, their objective is to save civilians, that they've saved tens of thousands of civilians, and that they're impartial. When in reality, they are partial. They're funded by the West, over $100 million.
$150 million is the figure I saw.
Yeah.
And some of that from Britain, quite a bit of it from Britain.
Precisely. And so you cannot be impartial.
And it was set up, wasn't it, by a British military officer?
Yes, James Le Mesurier, something like
Le
that.
Mesurier, yes. He's a man of the same name, was famous from Dad's army.
Right.
Mr. Le Mesurier is a former British Army officer, a former Foreign Office official, and he set up a human rights organization in Syria, which Britain and the US then gave $150 million to.
And there's also the New York firm, PR firm, Purpose Inc., which was also instrumental in many of these anti-Syria campaigns, including the White Helmets. But again, they only work in areas where terrorists like Al-Qaeda exist. And, you know, journalists like Vanessa Beeley, who've talked with people in eastern Aleppo and taken their testimonies, and they've said, look, we know them as al-Nusra's rescuers. They didn't help us. When I was in Greater Aleppo, as I call it, the area that the media completely obfuscated and wouldn't report on, people there didn't know about the White Helmets. And you would think that if the White Helmets were these legendary heroes, people in Greater Aleppo still had contact with their loved ones and friends in the east. But they didn't know anything about the White Helmets because this was all sold to a Western audience. And meanwhile, the real Syrian civil defense exists, and they were doing the heroic work. And George, I volunteered with Palestinian rescuers. On no occasion did I ever see a Palestinian rescuer act like these White Helmets. And I should say the White Helmets, in many instances, seem like they're acting, but Palestinian rescuers were just doing their job.
Well, actors normally get Oscars, and they have indeed been lavishly rewarded with these kind of accolades. The inverse of the truth is something that is demonstrated all the time, isn't it? You talked of Aleppo, which was wall-to-wall covered here in Britain as having fallen to the government forces and their allies.
Whereas Mosul
in Iraq
was liberated, wasn't it?
Yeah, Mosul was liberated, Aleppo fell.
Yeah.
The Iraqi government's recapture of Mosul was a great war hero story of liberation, whilst the liberation of East Aleppo from ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the alphabet soup of extremism was treated as if it ought to be a day of mourning.
Yeah.
Well, how do they get away with that? These journalists, are they lying or just stupid?
I would argue that most of them are knowingly lying, and some of them are stupid. But this question of lexicon is extremely important. Aleppo did not fall, it was liberated. And I was in Aleppo a month prior to it being liberated. And what the Western media told us was a revolution in bringing freedom and democracy. In Greater Aleppo, on a daily basis, they were being assaulted. The civilians were being assaulted by mortars, gas canister bombs, missiles, and snipings. And I was there on a day in which 18 people were killed and 200 injured by such freedom-loving terrorists. Acts of terrorism.
You were there.
Yeah, and documenting. And you know how I said many of them are knowingly lying because there were also a number of foreign journalists there from New York Times, from other Western press, and they did not report honestly. They reported on the casualties, the maimed and the injured, but then they reported some unsubstantiated reports of Syrian or Russian airstrikes elsewhere in Aleppo, as if to balance it out, and there's no balance. 11,000 civilians were killed in Aleppo alone by these terrorist acts of terrorism. So back to the question of Aleppo falling or being liberated, journalists should go there and speak with the Syrians, and they'll tell you, no, now we're free. Bana al-Abid, the wonder child, went to the United Nations, and she spoke about wanting peace and education for children. Well, Bana should have told her father and the terrorists that he was associated with to get out of the schools they were occupying. And as soon as Aleppo was liberated, schools opened again. And this is the pattern throughout Syria. As soon as these terrorist factions leave, people come back, schools open, and they start rebuilding their lives.
Yeah. Well, when you say the journalists are not reporting, they're just basically extensions of the establishment. They're no longer, they're just in disguise of journalists. That's what they are really, aren't they?
Someone recently said, and it's a very good quote, and I wonder if it was even yourself, but media is there to create the narrative, not to, I mean, the corporate media, not independent and honest media, to create a narrative, to sell it to the public. And that's what they do, repeating almost as if they're reading a script, the same things over and over again. The last doctors in Aleppo. Yeah. On my first trip to Aleppo in August 2016, I learned from the Aleppo Medical Association there weren't last doctors, there was over 4,000 doctors.
Yes, exactly.
But our media was saying the opposite.
We had one of them is a regular guest on our show, Dr.
Yes,
Ahmed
indeed.
Kadur.
Indeed. This ghastly carnage that you have witnessed at firsthand has killed an untold number of people, hundreds of thousands certainly. Millions of Syrians have cascaded outwards as refugees. What's the attitude of ordinary Syrian citizens now to their government? It's interesting, isn't it? Their government is always called a regime, but the Saudi government is always called a government. It's never called a regime.
Right.
I personally think both are regimes. You may differ. I think anybody who's not a democratic elected government is worthy of being called a regime, but it's only our enemies that we call regimes, and our friends, which are much worse than our enemies, are called governments. But what's the attitude of Syrian civilians to their government and to its allies? How are Russians viewed? Are people glad that they're there? Do they want them to leave? How are Iranians? How is Hezbollah viewed?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Syria, the president was democratically elected, and I was in Lebanon and saw at least the elections occurring in Lebanon in 2014, and President Bashar al-Assad was overwhelmingly chosen. And although the president is not the focus of most of my writings, it must be said that he does have overwhelming support. And wherever I've gone in Syria
no doubt about that,
and in Lebanon, I've met Syrians who actually love him.
Especially now. He's got much more support now than he had before they started.
But yes, also the question of Russians. Our media paints the Russians as the people that should not be in Syria, when the Syrian government welcomed the Russians. And the Syrian people I've met said, yes, we're glad the Russians came, because they're working with our allies, with Hezbollah, with our brave Syrian soldiers, and they're helping to bring peace. But again, our media won't acknowledge that. The American presence in Syria is illegal. They are occupying Syrian land. They have no right to be there. And they're killing Syrian civilians. And they're enabling ISIS, they were enabling ISIS to take over positions.
Eva Bartlett, stay safe and more power to your pen. Thanks for joining us on the Sputnik.
Thank you.
Coming up, a remarkable trip with a best-selling writer. Don't miss it.
Welcome back to Sputnik. The surreal, almost psychedelic brilliance of Addict by Stephen Smith is that, almost unbelievably, it isn't a novel, but an autobiography.
Addicted to vast quantities of amphetamines from his early teenage years, his dependence led him on a journey faster than any known roller coaster to a life of crime, prison, riches, poverty, mental institutions, broken homes, fortunes lost, regained and lost again.
It seemed impossible for me to believe that Stephen Smith could possibly have survived the life described in Volume 1 of his book. But he's now published Volume 2. He's alive and kicking, and here on our sofa on the Sputnik. Stephen, welcome to the Sputnik. You're the biggest selling author that I know. Millions of people read Volume 1. Most of them, like me, will have been amazed that you were still standing at the end of it. In the BBC documentary that you made accompanying Volume 1, you said that drugs had created a life of hell for you, a wasted life, and that the dark places that it led you to still haunt you. Just for those who are not amongst the millions who read the first volume, but who I hope will buy the second, briefly describe what that descent was like.
At the age of 14, I was given the first amphetamine pill, and for the next 20 years swallowed up to 100 tablets a day, got involved in organised crime. By the age of 21, I'm living in a mansion in Totteridge, and by the age of 31, I'm living in shop doorways. And from all the stolen millions, I finished up living in Sally Ann's, Salvation Army hostels, shop doorways, park benches, until I was 36 years old.
You were a very successful criminal.
Taught by the best.
You were taught by the best, as you say. Was the crime an addiction too, or was crime just to pay for the addiction?
No, if I'm honest, the crime was an addiction. When I look back, it's wrong to steal. But the excitement as a teenager and in my 20s, yeah, you enjoy it. And it's a kind of, it is a buzz. It's the only way I can describe it.
Yes, so it's a double addiction.
Yes,
double
it's a double
buzz.
addiction. And also, Van Gogh or, I don't know, Marlon Brando, they can brag about their work and show off with their work. The downside of crime is you can't hold an interview after and say, look what we done. We just tunnelled into a bank and stole $1 million. So you have to keep it to yourself. It's, which is a bit whatever.
Did you get caught for most of your crimes or not for any of them?
No.
Is there a statute of limitations? Might the Director of Public Prosecutions break in here?
No, my mind's at rest now that we're going back many years, and although it's common knowledge amongst a certain crowd what I did and didn't do, I can't be arrested for it. They've got to have evidence and they've got to, prove it.
I just spotted there the Chinese edition of your book. You must be the only bank robber in history to have a book about them in Chinese.
God rest his soul, Bruce Reynolds, Ronnie Biggs, and one or two others.
These were the great train robbers for younger viewers.
Train robbers. Yes, they had their books on the shelves in English, but I'm the only bank robber, if that's what you want to call me, that had his story told in Chinese.
It is, therefore, all the more remarkable that you pulled out of this vortex an addiction to crime, big crime, an addiction, 100 tablets a day of amphetamines, and became an entirely sober Christian, doing good, brilliant, successful author. That's almost as remarkable as the life that you're writing about, isn't it?
I really enjoy writing because, A, you're working on your own, so you've got nobody driving your potty, and I kind of enjoy the perfection of editing it and so on. And I say this to many people, it's not that the reason it's sold so well is not that I'm a good writer, but I write from the heart. I tell you how I really felt. The new book has got photos in it, and I won't mention names now, but also one or two very well-known people and their homes, because at my time of life now, I just wanted to tell it all as much as I could and keep my liberty, obviously.
What prompted you to write the second volume?
I think I've just been through, and I can talk about this quite freely, the most painful 20 years of my life. I didn't pick up drink again, I didn't pick up drugs. At the end of the book, the first book, I fall in love with a German girl, a princess, blah, 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 and this woman changed her sex and became a man. And I still love him. My boys still love him, but it was very painful, and I think for me it was lethargic, if that's the right word, to write it all down, what happened, and
but you found love again, you found marriage again.
Yeah, with my wife, who's now the boss. I'm now married to the mafia, as I call her, and I'm more frightened of her than all the gangsters in the whole world. What she says goes.
You've devoted now years of your life and a lot of your money to trying to rescue people from the kind of life that you had, living in shop doorways, dependent on substances that are slowly or quickly killing them. It's a bit of a losing battle, though, isn't it? Because homelessness has now risen for the 7th year in a row. Drugs are everywhere. The violence associated with them is everywhere. What could society do? How did we get here?
I think we got here because The majority of politicians are only interested in their own careers. They're not interested in curing homelessness. No names again, but I would work for nothing for the government, and I will guarantee, I'll sign the document that I'll confess to every big crime I was ever involved with if I don't cure homelessness completely, given the, not funds to me, but funds to do what we need to do within 2 years. It's like washing up. If the washing up needs doing, you go and do the washing up. Don't talk about washing up, go and do it.
And
Sorry,
how would that be
angry.
done? I mean, Jeremy Corbyn has just talked about sequestering, really, 8,000 empty homes and a crash house-building programme. That's the kind of thing that would put paid
Yeah,
to
I
it,
like it. I like it.
I mean, people are talking about the price of it, but what's the price of not doing it?
The price of not doing it, this might sound a bit melodramatic, I think you'll have anarchy on the streets in 10, 20 years' time where drug addicts will kill for a fix. It's getting worse. So I'm not talking a load of rubbish. If you go back 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, it's getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. You'll have anarchy. I think that's the word, when you have mayhem.
Yeah.
You've already got it in some areas.
Well, you know, we live in London where knife crime and homicide is multiplying at a frightening rate, where drugs are everywhere.
Yeah.
The police don't have enough numbers to get on top of it, where the price of drugs has fallen so low that a very significant number of people are... I mean, when you started out, it was only people that, you know, were quite wealthy that had access to narcotic drugs. Now, at a tenner a shot, there are plenty of people who are now dependent on something that is a tenner a shot, and if they don't have the tenner, they're going to get it off you, and if necessary, they're going to stab you to get the tenner.
I would give life imprisonment with no parole, life imprisonment for any drug dealer, whether they're selling £10 worth of hash or £1 billion worth of cocaine, life. Because if the deterrent is strong enough, it's like parking a car. If the minimum parking ticket was £1 million, nobody would leave their car on the yellow line. Life with no parole.
So would you agree that the war on drugs is not really a war then?
The war on drugs, we're losing it.
I mean, frankly, you know, I came through an airport yesterday. Not only was I not searched, nobody was searched.
Yeah.
I'm of a certain age. I have only once in my entire life been searched, and that was for political reasons, politically motivated reasons. There's drugs and weapons flowing into this country.
Correct.
And the state, instead of increasing the forces to combat it, is thinning them out. So we need a war on drugs, and we are losing it. That's a controversial point of view. There are people who say, liberals, and never confuse me with one of those, who say we need to legalise drugs. What's your take on that?
No, total rubbish. You can't... OK, it's so rubbish. If you legalise hash, for example, what do you tell a teenager when he's got his exams coming up at the end of the week? Is it OK for him to smoke 1 joint, 4 joints, 8 joints, or what? And hash and all these drugs lead to other types of drugs. And I know this will sound totally ridiculous because prohibition is like here and gone in history, but if you look at the high streets on a Saturday night, they're like war zones. The girls, the boys, they don't know what they're doing. They're all out of their skulls.
No, you're right.
Blah, blah, blah.
So, Addict, which is now basically a combined Volume 1 and Volume 2, published by Westworld.
Yep.
And on sale in the shops, what, in about 6 weeks from now?
Time, yeah.
So our viewers got a preview. I tell you this, if Volume 2 is half as good as Volume 1, it'll sell millions more.
Yeah.
Stephen Smith, thanks for joining us.
Thank you
on the
very
Sputnik.
much. Thank you.
And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
We asked the question, is the war ending in Syria or actually starting again? James Healy says it's just starting because the US can't have the wrong side winning. Scott says if the USA has its way, it will be kicking off again. And finally, Rob Perry, of course it's starting again. No side. I mean no side. in this is honorable or interested in peace. So expect the Kurds to come under pressure from all sides now and the US to stand back. This is where the next humanitarian disaster will take place.
Well, it's all a humanitarian disaster, but on the Kurdish point, there's no doubt that the Kurds have throughout history been picked up and then put back on the shelf, picked up again when they are useful. It's entirely opportunistic, the US involvement with them. I take a different view. I think the war itself has been won. There will be a long-running, low-level terrorist insurrection, but the war itself has been won by Syria and its allies.
Yeah, I agree. And that's all the time we've got for tweets today.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
But you can stay in touch with us on social media, Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today, or Twitter and Instagram, RT_Sputnik. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.